Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah. Amma ba'd. I'd like to welcome everyone to Mental Health Awareness, Black American Muslim Opinion. And today's focus will be racial battle fatigue, RBF, coined by Dr. William Smith. Racial battle fatigue, RBF, was a term coined in 2008 by critical race theorist William Smith. It was originally used in reference to experiences of African American men in America, but is now expanded to describe the negative and racially charged experiences of all people of color, POC, in the United States, right? So, and this is something I want to touch on with regards to this part. And this article, you can find it on www.ttsdschools.org/site/handlers/filedownload.ashx ? And to the end of that. So this is where I got the article from. So, but this point right here that I want to talk about, when he coined it, it was originally for African Americans, right? And now it's utilized for all POC, people of color, right? I want to touch on that because what we find in the case with African Americans, right? Whenever there is something that is designated for African Americans, it always finds its place among others as well, right? Whether you're talking about civil rights, whether you're talking about affirmative action, whatever is coined or utilized or for African Americans, you will find that others also utilize the same terminology, right? And this opens up the door for benign neglect, coined also by Daniel A. Moynihan from the 60s. And he was a sociologist during the Johnson and Nixon administration, right? And what happens with benign neglect is that when an issue comes up that is specifically for African Americans, what happens is they'll look for other groups, basically like a comparison contrast. They'll look for other groups, right? And they will talk about other groups. They will focus on other groups. For example, I mentioned affirmative action, right? And affirmative action, although it was pretty vague what it actually meant, affirmative action, number one, has always been for white people. When you look at the history of the United States of America, it has always been for European Americans, whether you're talking about the land grab, whether you're talking about reparations being paid to the former slave holders, or whether or not you're talking about in the 20th century, the issues of the New Deal, right? During the administration of FDR. European Americans have always benefited from projects or studies wherein African Americans could also benefit. Instead of African Americans getting reparations, right? The 40 acres and a mule, they was allowed to what? open a bank account, right? And so the things that African Americans could have gotten were basically given to European Americans, right? During the administration of President Andrew Johnson, who was the 17th president. He became the president after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. So with that being said, that's just what I want to touch on briefly with regards to this article that now is utilized for people of color, right? Utilized for people of color. And African Americans once again get pushed, gets pushed. But the fortunate thing about this issue is that William Smith is still alive. And I encourage many of you to go on YouTube, William Smith, or you can type in Google, or I'm sorry, YouTube, which is owned by Google. You can type in racial battle fatigue. You type that in and videos of him will come up, right? But what I want to talk about is racial battle fatigue as it relates to the Muslims, right? The African American Muslims. But before we delve into that, the first thing we want to look at is the definition. The definition of racial battle fatigue. William Smith defines RBF as cumulative result of a natural race-related stress. Cumulative result of a natural race-related stress response to distressing mental and emotional conditions. These conditions emerge from constantly facing racially dismissive, demeaning, insensitive, and or hostile racial environments and individuals. So this is where racial battle fatigue comes into play. It comes as a result of bombardment of hostile racial environment, insensitive, demeaning, hostile racial environment. You're bombarded every day. Microaggressions or macroaggressions, right? So this is the issue. So we go on, and that's the definition of it. So it goes on. People of color experience daily battles of attempting to deflect racism, stereotypes, and discrimination in predominantly white spaces, and must always be on guard or weary to the next attack they may face. Both the anticipation and experiences of racial trauma contribute to racial battle fatigue, right? So this part right here, I want to add, it's not mentioned in this article, but I'm going to bring it up. Although it mentions people of color, one of the things that I find, and many of you can agree, even if you disagree, it's there. The reality is there. Whether you agree or you disagree, it really doesn't matter. The reality is there. And that is that to add to this, I will say also, this is Haneef, I will say, not only do you have to worry about white spaces, but I will also say if you are dark skinned, you still have to worry about brown spaces. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that there's still the propensity to discriminate against dark skinned people, whether those individuals be in Africa, Asia, or the Americas, right? Dark-skinned people have the propensity to be put down, even if they are from amongst the same ethnic group. What do I mean? What I mean by that is you will find lighter-skinned Arabs demeaning and degrading darker skinned Arabs. You will find lighter skinned Hispanics degrading and demeaning darker skinned Hispanics. You will also find lighter skinned Indians from India demeaning and degrading darker skinned Indians in the South, right? This is what I mean. So within a society, right, that have the same ethnic group or different ethnic groups, one is light, one is dark, we still find what? We still find hostile, demeaning behaviors from lighter skinned people to dark skinned people, of dark skinned people. This is the point that I want to make with regards to this, because although it looks at POCs in general, people of color in general, I like to look at, okay, what's the situation with regards to lighter skin POC and darker skin POC? Does the lighter skin POC treat the darker skin POC differently? And we find that this is the case. And we find that this is true. And we find this amongst what? The Muslim community, right? African American Muslims complain a lot about the racism or the ethnocentrism that comes from the immigrant population. And I've heard of similar complaints coming from out of Canada and also coming from out of the UK and the likes. And this is the issue that the Muslims have to work on in and of themselves by going back to the book of Allah and the Sunnah of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam to see where they went wrong, and then to reflect, right? To make muhasabah, to make themselves accountable for their behavior, right? So these are things that within the Muslim community we have to be cognizant of. Also amongst the African Americans, you find the issue of lighter skinned African Americans and darker skinned African Americans, the issue of colorism. It arises. It arises. And no doubt this comes as a result of African Americans mixing with Native Americans, mixing with European Americans during slavery and outside of slavery, but it also stems from the reality of the society promoting lighter skin being better, whether advertently or inadvertently. This is what we find. And what's my proof? My proof is when we look at missing persons, right? The situation with the young lady, Petito, I think her name was. Her boyfriend still on the run, or fiance still on the run. No one knows where he is. He's a person of interest. Hasn't been charged with anything, but he is now on the run. But anyway, she was strangled. But the point that I'm getting at is that that in that tragedy, we find that when white women are put in the media, there's always, for the most part, huge searches looking for them. And especially from my observation, especially blonde white women. And that same energy is not put into darker skinned people. It's not put into darker skinned people who go missing, right? And this is a result of the society, right? This is a result of the society. So with that being said, we'll go on with the article, Racial Battle Fatigue. It said racial battle fatigue causes people of color to suffer various forms of mental, emotional, and physical strain, which can lead to psychophysiological symptoms. Now we're getting into what racial battle fatigue causes people of color. The symptoms of RBS are suppressed immunity and increased sickness, which makes sense because due to stress or compounded stress, stress upon stress upon stress, it can wreak havoc on your immune system, which prevents you from getting over any type of virus or any other type of ailment wherein your immune system is compromised, right? Your immune system is compromised. So, moving on, and we're going to continue. It said increase sickness. Now, tension headaches, trembling and jumpiness, chronic pain and chronic pain in healed injuries. Chronic pain in healed injuries, elevated blood pressure, and a pounding heartbeat. When people of color with RBF anticipate racially motivated conflicts, they may experience rapid breathing, an upset stomach, or frequent diarrhea or urination. Other possible symptoms are constant anxiety, which is huge. And you talk about anxiety, anxiety is major because when depression sets in, 9 times out of 10, there's no depression without anxiety. Anxiety is all over the place in emotional as well as psychological issues. Anxiety is always there, right? Okay, so it says constant anxiety, ulcers, increased swearing, a person curses a lot, or complaining. And complaining can also be a result of rumination, right? Rumination. Rumination is when you think negatively about your situation, your plight, right? And it prevents you, with these negative thoughts, it prevents you from being able to move forward, right? Rumination. So increased swearing or complaining, insomnia or stress anxiety dreams, rapid mood swings, right? A lot of African Americans with rapid mood swings, difficulty thinking or speaking coherently, and emotional/social withdrawal in response to racial microaggressions, or when in environments of mundane racial stresses, that you shut down. These stresses can lead to long-term health issues and cause people of color to lose confidence in themselves and their self-worth. And this is very important because many of us, due to the oppression that our people went through, and now we're at the stage of we don't see as much physical oppression or macroaggressions like in the past, but we find it now in benign neglect, right? In the system of color blindness, or we find it in gentrification, right? Where segregation is still maintained. But what happens is the people who didn't want you in their neighborhoods, they come into your neighborhood, fix it up, and then the taxes are raised. So wherein you have to leave. Not only do they fix up the places that were unsuitable or those places they will run down, they fix them up. Now the price triples. In many cases, quadruples. For example, here in Durham, North Carolina, there's a street called Holloway. And on Holloway Street, that's the hood. But what's happening is that area is being gentrified. And a house that cost about $64,000. The person purchased the house, $64,000. They went in it, they fixed it up. I mean, it's nice. It's nice. But after they hooked the house up, they put the house on the market. The house costs now 620 or 640,000. Now you quadruple your money. And they did this not because of what the property is worth now. They did this with the anticipation that in the future, not too far future, that this is going to be the place to be. So basically the plans are already in motion. And this can cause what? Stress for the people who lived in that area, right? Or the person who owns their home, now they have to leave. They have to leave their home, find somewhere else to stay, right? So, or they keep the home, but the taxes are so high, then they're forced out. You understand what I'm saying? So this is the issue of microaggression, right? And then on top of that, to add insult to injury, you're only bringing in people, for the most part, that look like you. You understand me? Not the people who were the original inhabitants of that particular neighborhood. Racism is often perceived as a personal threat or battle. This is how the person with racial battle fatigue feels about racism. They have to be on guard. They have to be ready to battle it, have to be ready to fight it, right? It's a threat. And sometimes it can cause a person to overreact. And we'll get into that a little later in this article. It can cause a person to overreact. Wherein a situation may not be racial, but you perceive it as racial due to what? Due to ongoing aggressions, right? And what happens with that is that people look at you like, hey, man, not everything's about racism. Man, cut that out. You see what I'm saying? So without the people themselves looking at why the African Americans are the way that they are. The African Americans, for the most part, didn't make themselves overcautious. The African Americans didn't make themselves not to trust the government or not to trust the medical community. That's not something the African Americans did. But as usual, that reality is never looked at. No, you have to modify your behavior based on what happened to you, wherein the community that caused the problem in the first place aren't doing anything to fix the issues that caused your doubt and your discontent and your ability not to trust in the first place. No modification is done on that end. None. And if they do try to fix it, it's a band-aid put on the issue. When you have an abscess, right? You have to cut the abscess, drain it, and then pack it so that it can heal from the inside out. See what I'm saying? These individuals don't want to acknowledge the role that they or their forefathers played in anything. They won't acknowledge it. And so if they won't acknowledge it, they don't feel they have to do anything. Everything is on you, right? You have all the symptoms, right? You have all the symptoms, and you have to work through your symptoms. But at the same time, the people who cause the symptoms or cause the problem whereby you have the symptoms, They don't have to do anything. And that's the way they feel. And this is a huge problem. This is a huge problem. So moving along, after facing that threat or battle continuously in predominantly white spaces, people of color may experience RBF, leaving them mentally, physically, and emotionally drained. That's when the psychology of self-hate and self-defeat comes in also. This race-based trauma can create symptoms and experiences, much like PTSD. And I will also add, it can also create symptoms similar to PTSS, post-traumatic slave syndrome, coined by Dr. Joy DeGruy. If RBF goes untreated or dismissed, this stress-related psychological and physiological disease can be lethal and can kill gradually and stealthily through hypertension and poor health attitudes and behaviors, right? So what they do here is they have racial microaggressions, right? And surrounding it, you have on the left, you have psychological stress responses, right? Then you have physiological stress responses. And then you have behavioral stress responses. So we'll look at the psychological stress responses. The first example is frustration, defensiveness, apathy, irritability, sudden changes in mood, shock, anger, disappointment, resentment, anxiety, worry, disbelief, disappointment, helplessness, hopelessness, and fear. And this is the stage that I believe most African Americans are at. This right here, this stage. Because many African Americans, they complain about their issue, right? To the point nothing is done. Because why? They feel hopeless and helpless. Why? Not because they don't want to do anything, not because they lack volition. No, it's especially a person well versed in history. What do you find when you study the history of African Americans, right? Every time there's an uprising from slavery to the 20th century, every time that there was an uprising and the push for inclusion and equal rights and like this, they were put down violently or with policies, right? And one only needs to look at the year 1700 all the way through the 1799, all those slave revolts. We can go in the 1800s if you want. You can count the slave revolt in New York where the slaves like to burn New York City to the ground at the time in the 1700s, right? All the way to Nat Turner and John Brown, right? They were constantly put down, not to mention the various uprisings in the nation's cities, the riots of Watts, Detroit, Newark, New Jersey, Philly, right? The move, right? Like this, right? And even the smaller towns that had their riots, like right here in North Carolina, Monroe, right? To only find that they got squashed. The Black Panthers Party, right? The Young Lords Party, right? Like this, COINTELPRO, the RICO Act, right? Revolutions always put down harshly. And then to add insult to injury, they utilize your own people to do what? Help the system, right? In the case of Denmark Vesey, in the case of Fred Hampton, right? So in the case of Dr. Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, like this, utilizing people who look like you to go against you. So these are some of the points that played a role in causing the psychological the psychological stressors with regards to RBF.